Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Tom Radigan, and wow, has it been a hot minute since I've seen you guys. I realized I did not post a video in 2025, and now we are in 2026 in the new year. I hope everybody has been having a great holiday. It's great to see all you good-looking people out there, and I think it was a wonderful time this last week. Having a little bit of a winter break from my job, and getting a chance to enjoy the holidays. With my girlfriend, with my friends and family. So it was really nice and really fun. And one thing I was able to do on my holiday break is get a chance to go on DisneyPlus and see the Beatles Anthology series that was released this year, released in 2025. And what was interesting about it was, the reason why it was released, it was the 30th anniversary of when they did the anthology. So it was actually just reissued interviews from the 90s that was in the video. But I wanted to actually talk about that today. I was in my car just for a drive and figured, why not do a quick video talking about the Beatles Anthology series? Because that was what was so interesting to me, seeing that series. It was really, really fun being a Beatles fan, and hey, I'm representing my Beatles merch, all that, representing the sweatshirt, hey, I always love wearing my Beatles stuff, hey, represent the Beatles merch, represent the Beatles, hey. I wanted to talk about it because it was so special to me being a Beatles fan. I have been a lifelong Beatles fan ever since I was a little kid. I mean, definitely, I know I've been a consistent Beatles fan for 20 years when I first heard the album Revolver, and it changed my life. I've talked about this before on my YouTube channel about how I love Revolver so much. It's such a great album, and I think that is what was so interesting about the documentary, was because it represented all the Beatles albums, talking about Revolver, talking about Sgt. Pepper, talking about their first album. They did such a great job going into detail about the relationship with the Beatles. And what's interesting about this documentary is it's not your normal type of documentary. It's not really, there's not as much narration. It's pretty much all from the four guys, from John, Paul, George, and Ringo themselves, just talking about this. And what was interesting about the documentary, which you find out, so I am going to go into information about it, so if you want to watch the documentary first, then maybe come back to this video. But they do say in the documentary, at like one of the last episodes, because it's like 9 episodes, and basically it was reissued because it came out in the 90s, but in 2025 they decided to just do some new edits to it, trim some stuff, add some stuff. They added a new episode to it, so there's like some new stuff to it, of course. And what was really interesting about it was that they talk about the documentary, how it was a project that started for since the 1970s, since the Beatles broke up. Neil Aspinall, who was a part of the Beatles crew, who was actually worked for Apple. It was the CEO of Apple, actually. So he was very involved in the Beatles empire, and he was under the impression of doing a documentary for the Beatles, back in 1970, right after they broke up. So he was under the impression that he was going to do that. And he decided to get all the archival footage that they had from their footage, and then from other footage around the world. And they did that and put it in a chronological order, like the footage. So years later, they kind of revisit this project in the early 90s. Now, John Lennon already has been killed at this point. So, it's just the 3 of them left. So the anthology project, and this is what I love about the Beatles, is that they would go into a project and then it would come into something different. And that's kind of what anthology is. And of course, the most famous example of that would be, the Get Back series that came out a few years ago that talked about the Let It Be album, about how when they did the film for it, it was supposed to be a big concert, and then they ended up playing on the roof. That's kind of what anthology was too. It was more of anthology was basically their point of view, all 4 of them, which is like they said, it's not your normal documentary. It's all 4 of them talking, with John Lennon, from interviews from over the years, from whether it was the 60s or the 70s, or even in the last year of his life in 1980. So there's a lot of, like, you know, interesting points of view of them talking about them, you know, themselves meeting each other, the relationship they all had with each other. So it was really, really, like, interesting for, you know, a Beatles fan to see all that, you know, and it was great, you know, getting a chance to, you know, be in 2025, see something from 30 years ago with, you know, even though John was not there, but you see something with George, Paul, and Ringo talking about it. So that was what was so cool at that time, that they were able to create a project like that and talk about like, you know, all their albums, talk about the history of the Beatles, and then also ended up doing more than just a documentary. And that was, they wanted to see if there was songs that they had that John did that they could maybe create a new Beatles song with. And that's what I thought what was so interesting about it, was because we know, of course, that in 1990s during the anthology, Yoko had tapes that she gave to Paul, and Paul gave it to, you know, George and Ringo. They all three worked on the songs that she gave. She gave 4 songs, what it was. So it was Freebird and Real Love, which came out that time, which, even though they were, like, you know, songs from a recording from John that they all, you know, overdubbed, they're still great songs, honestly. Everybody talks about Freebird, but Free as a Bird, I really love Real Love more. Like, Real Love is the song that I love the most out of Free as a Bird and Real Love. And then, of course, they had a song that Grow Old With Me, which was a song that was released from after John died, called Grow Old With Me. And so they had a recording of that. They didn't really do anything with that, I believe. And then there was Now and Then, which, of course, you know, 2 years ago they came out with a Beatles song that was Now and Then, which was, you know, considered now our last Beatles song. So it was cool that we had a Beatles song in our lifetime from 2023. That was really cool. And that, I think, is what is so interesting about this documentary. Is 2 things that I want to go over before I go more into other stuff. Is that the fact that the Beatles are able to still, it's been 60 years since the Beatles have been famous, like over 60 years at this point, you know. We're now in 2026, so 60 years ago was 1966. Beatles were already big at this point, you know. So the fact that we are deep into over 60 years of knowing who the Beatles are, and the fact that there are so many fans all over the world that still love the Beatles so much, it's amazing to me that the Beatles empire is able to still exist and still release new stuff with, of course, you know, like I said, Now and Then that came out in 2023, the Get Back series that came out in 2021, this series and the anthology. Like, the fact that they're able to still release new stuff. I mean, they're even releasing documentaries with, you know, a John Lennon documentary that came out about a year ago, and then there was there's a new documentary coming out about Paul called Man on the Run. So the fact that they're able to still release new material about the Beatles, new information, is great. And what was interesting about the documentary, how they talk about Now and Then, they kind of leave it on, and remember, this is back in 1995, so they were talking about how they did the 2 songs, Free as a Bird and Real Love, and then they tried Now and Then, and they didn't work on it. But they talk about how they could come back to it, you know, in some ways. So they always made it seem like, you know, in that documentary, that even though the Beatles are gone, there are ways they can come back. Because, and I think that focuses on the empire the Beatles created in music. I mean, the Beatles brand is so important to our culture, to, of course, well, English culture, because of course they were from England, but even America. I mean, we love the Beatles so much. I mean, that it's over. I mean, you know, I mean, you know me as being one of, like, the biggest Beatles fans on, you know, I talk about it on my channel. I mean, yes, the Beatles are my favorite musicians. There is nothing, I always love music and I always love artists. But there are times, like, things come and go where you're into certain stuff. Never have I ever been out of touch with the Beatles. I've always loved the Beatles. There's never been a time where I'm like, screw the Beatles, you know? No. So that's what was so interesting about this documentary, being a Beatles fan, seeing all these 9 episodes, talking about how they started from the 4 of them and their point of view. And, you know, like I said, being a huge Beatles fan, I know a lot of this information already, but there were some interesting new things I found out. Like, for instance, when they were the Quarrymen, they, of course, famously, like, now it's famous that they recorded a Buddy Holly song, That'll Be a Day, because they were huge Buddy Holly fans, into Buddy Holly and Elvis. That's what started the Quarrymen, is their love for for rock and roll. So in 1958, they went to a studio and recorded "That'll Be the Day." John, Paul, George, and I forget who the drummer was, or who the other person from the Quarrymen that was with them. Yeah, so they did "That'll Be the Day," and then he did a song called "In Spite of All the Danger." Now, "In Spite of All the Danger" is interesting because that was an original back then. So they were writing Paul and John were writing songs back then. It was a song written by Paul, and George actually gets credit for it, for coming up with the guitar solo. So I didn't actually know that Paul and George actually wrote a song back in 1958, which is unbelievable considering the Beatles were not known at that point. We're not like, it was like then, 1958, then that means that like 6 years later, that was when the Beatles went on Ed Sullivan Show. So nobody really knew in America who the Beatles were until 6 years later. So that's what was so interesting. And George really, there's not that many songs that George wrote with John and Paul. The only other song that's so that's the only song I can think of that George wrote with Paul then. The only song that I know that John wrote with George was a song that the Beatles did when they were in Germany called "Cry for a Shadow," which is an instrumental. So, but that, I thought what was interesting about it was they talked about the songwriting partnership that John and Paul had when they were 16, and when John was 16, Paul was 14, and they started writing songs right away together. And they talked about that early on. They wondered if they should have included George in the songwriting process, and they didn't. They kept it kind of like a duo collaboration. And George, in the documentary, talks about they talk about George's growth as a songwriter over the years, and how George was learning to be a new songwriter. Especially during the time of Help, Rubber Soul, when he was starting to write his own material more, and he had 2 songs on each album. So that was what was so interesting. Being a big Beatles fan, watching that documentary is it's so cool. And it just shows you too that the Beatles really never die. Even what was interesting is they talk about in 1966 when they stopped touring and they were all doing side projects. Another thing I learned that I thought was really interesting was I know that John went to do a movie called How I Won the War. George went to India, with Ravi Shankar, and learned more about the sitar and and culture from India. And Paul actually ended up doing musical scores with George Martin. And which was really interesting. I know that they did it for some kind of film that came out in England, and they won some kind of, were nominated for some kind of award in England. So that was, I thought, was interesting to me. And yeah, no, so it was really cool. And I think there's something to be said about Beatles fans that really love these documentaries and love the new stuff that comes out. I can be a cynic at times and be like, oh, it's just more money for Paul and Ringo. But at the same time, it's really cool seeing new stuff new documentaries that come out about information from the Beatles that have been around for years. But so it really is cool seeing that, and like I said, there were little things I learned from the documentary, but most of the stuff I knew, being a huge Beatles fan. But it's you don't care. You're almost like a child again, watching the magic of John, Paul, George, and Ringo, out there just playing, especially, seeing clips of them on the Ed Sullivan Show or performing together with all the screaming fans. And, being a Beatles fan, as a kid, I got it from, I learned to be a Beatles fan from my dad. My dad, and I are 40 years apart. My dad was I was a kid listening to the Beatles music in the 2000s. Dad was a kid in the 60s listening to the Beatles when they were fresh out, right into releasing new music. That, that's insane too, But even now, in the past month or two, when I wear this Beatles sweatshirt, there are people that come to me and be like, oh, the Beatles, it's great, you love the Beatles. I see people wherever in my town or wherever I am, they're saying I could never forget a guy who wears a sweatshirt that has the Beatles on it. So I just find that so interesting that they are still such a big part of our culture, and this documentary represents that. So I definitely think it's important for Beatles fans to watch this documentary. And even if it's funny, I had this conversation with my girlfriend because we were talking about it. My girlfriend said, would it be an interesting documentary for somebody who's not that into the Beatles or doesn't know that much about the Beatles? And I said yes, that this is the documentary. I would say if for instance the Get Back series, I would tell people it might not be for you if you're not a huge Beatles fan. And if you like documentaries, it's not your normal documentary, because that's like 3 hours of footage of John and Paul, George and Ringo in the studio talking. That might not be interesting for some people, but people who are huge Beatles fans love that stuff, because they are just like, you know, like talking, they're like going, you know, being witty, you know, and we love this because these are songs that we've loved for years. And the fact that they were talking about this when they were doing Get Back, like, that's interesting. But like in this documentary, it's interesting because it really is the history of the Beatles, so anybody can watch it. It's 9 episodes. Each episode is an hour. It's really, you know, it's easy to get through. So, you know, it's easier to get through this than, of course, the Get Back series, for sure. So I definitely think it is worth watching. And the reason why I wanted to do this was, like I said, I haven't been on YouTube for a while, and I just wanted to, you know, post something that, you know, meant something to me, you know. And this was like, you know, watching this Beatles documentary, because like I said, this is a music commentary channel, and I sometimes really want to just only sometimes post now these days, you know, when I find something that really interests me, you know. That's kind of how I feel about stuff. So I know I've been coming and going, but this video to me, talking about the Beatles, is very special because, you know, now we are in a new year, and I'm also heading to my 10-year anniversary on YouTube, which is crazy. And the fact that I haven't been on my channel as much, you know, shows that, like, you know, I'm in and out with stuff, but, you know, I do still, you know, care to want to talk to people about stuff, want to talk about music, want to have conversations, want to do all that. And definitely, if you know, I'm curious to know what you guys felt about this documentary, or even what new music is coming out. So definitely comment on my channel. It's always great to talk about stuff that that makes you curious, that is interesting to you. And definitely, like, this is the thing that, you know, watching this Beatles documentary was so interesting enough that I had to make a video. Like I said, even though it's been a while, I was like, I had to make a video because it was so good, and I feel like I need to talk about it. And that's what I think is so great about art too, is that you get a chance to really kind of talk about what you love, and that's kind of why this was a spur of the moment YouTube video that, you know, like I said, even though you haven't seen me in a while, that's why I came up with this video for today. Thank you guys for watching this. You know, hit that thumbs up. You know, I've been saying that stuff for years. Hit that thumbs up, hit that bell notification, and please subscribe. Bye. Hey, I gotta do that stuff for old times. Come on, hey, what can I say?